Whether you wear a badge or not, if you care about courage, clarity, discipline, and the price of decisions in the moment that define lives, you've come to the right place. This is where training meets consequence, where the law collides with human behavior, and the fog of uncertainty tests the limits of reason. These are the stories of pressure, of purpose, and what it means to hold the line when the world loses balance. I'm Don, a police officer, instructor, and founder of Forecast Securities Group, and I'll be your guide through the storm. Welcome to the Conditions Report.
Hey, Don, I'm Chris. I'm a criminal defense attorney in Monterey, California. I've been an attorney for 15 years. Primarily do criminal defense myself, but my office also does immigration and we fight traffic tickets. So I've read quite literally thousands of police reports. I've watched hundreds of videos of my clients being arrested. I've taken hundreds of cases to trial. And I want to hear your side of it and your experience with what you do.
Nice. Chris, nice to meet you. I've been a police officer for now approaching 17 years. The first 14 of my career I spent with the California Highway Patrol, and now I work at a municipal police department. So obviously same avenue. I spent 10 of those years as a detective on a major crimes task force, and obviously authored hundreds and hundreds of search warrants, served hundreds of search warrants, been a part of thousands of criminal investigations, testified in court as an expert. So on the opposite side to some extent, right? But all part of the same system. So yeah, let's get into it.
I knew you were in law enforcement. I didn't know that you had worked for the CHP.
I did, yeah.
When you were doing your CHP work and you would do traffic trials, was there a district attorney there?
Typically, no. Yeah, so most of my traffic experience, I've testified thousands of times in traffic court, as you can imagine. CHP, big, heavy traffic enforcement agency. But most of mine was not even in front of a judge. A lot of times it's just in front of a court-appointed traffic commissioner, which a lot of times is a judge, but sometimes it's just an attorney. And in those cases, yeah, you don't have a district attorney there. It's just you and then the defendant.
So it's interesting because I actually got into criminal defense first with traffic cases. I was doing appearances for attorneys that were in other counties that had good marketing. And they would get these traffic cases in Monterey County and they'd pay me like $100 or $200 to go and take them to trial. And we don't have district attorneys in the traffic court here. So it's been over 10 years now I've been doing this. I'd go in there and it would just be me versus the CHP. Over time, I developed kind of a monopoly on traffic cases in this county. And every Monday I go in there and there might be as many as 24 CHP officers just waiting in the hall. And we would always talk about the cases, see if we could resolve them before going in. And it would just be me and, 20 cops just talking about the cases. And I really got a lot out of that, talking to them about their experience and what they do. It's different than in an actual criminal case, where there is a district attorney who would run up and be like, don't talk to my witness, right? It's a whole different experience. That it's more face-to-face. And actually, I consider a number of those guys my friends right now. But that's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because, a lot of times the person who's getting the citation for whatever it may be, right? A lot of times that's a moving violation, speed or something like that. And they want it resolved with as little money as possible, and they don't want the point because they don't want their insurance to go up, right? And then, you as an attorney, you want to resolve because, you want to win on your side, right? And for us, a lot of times, when you're writing thousands and thousands of tickets, a lot of times you just want to go home, right? You're like, I'm ready to go home. So a lot of times you get these hallway plea deals where you're like, hey, I'll change it to where I'm good to change it to coasting instead of speed, right? No point. Exactly. And then, we can all go home happy. So definitely been a part of some of those hallway conversations for sure.
Yeah. Everyone's a winner when it gets knocked down to coasting.
Yeah. No moving violation, looks like a win for you. Looks like a win for us, because then we get to leave, So,
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. I think it's actually really important because, working at a municipal police department, those guys actually a lot of times will go years before the first time they actually have to testify in court. And that could be good, it could be bad, but a lot of times those cases that they're going to testify on are like oh, it's the first time I'm testifying, and it's like a felony domestic violence case where like it actually matters, right? Like you have a victim and, you know, all of the things that you did actually matter. You know, maybe you had a search in a house, like all this stuff is really important.
Right.
Well, I think the advantage CHP has to some extent is right away, as soon as you start writing tickets, which is like day one there, right? You're going to start getting subpoenaed. And, you know, traffic's important, but it's not as important as some of these other cases, in my opinion, just because it's a little lower threshold. A lot of times it's just regular people making a mistake as opposed to like significant crime. So what's nice though is even though those testimonies are kind of informal and they're not huge cases, it gets you comfortable with being up there, talking about what you did, talking through the details like, oh, I'm certified to run a radar or LiDAR, right? I'm certified to estimate speed. This is what happened. And you start to work the kinks out of how to testify, right? I actually think that puts CHP in an advantage because, you know, when you start going to these DUI cases or some of the more important stuff, you've already testified, you know, hundreds of times, which is very unusual for like a municipal police department. So I actually think that puts them in a little bit of advantage. I'm fortunate that was part of the early part of my career.
Well,
Made me feel.
I'm sure it gives you confidence when you come back later. I've actually, I'm saying, developed friendships with a number of the officers that have been around for a while, just from running into them over and over again. And sometimes there'll be a rookie, and I'll be like, "You guys want me to take him to task? You want me to get after him right here?" And I'll joke around. It's like, no, look, it's better. It's better for you to get tripped up here. Not like I'm really trying to help the cops, right? I'm not. But if I trip them up, if they forget an element, if they lose something, and then when we're walking out of there, I'll be like, don't worry, man. Like what they had to pay me to come. I don't think that they just got off easy, but wasn't it better that you experienced that here as opposed to in the felony courtroom during a prelim? You know, so
Yeah.
well, and then the other side of it is that when I was getting my feet wet, doing all of those like hundreds and hundreds of traffic trials, that got me as a criminal defense attorney used to asking cops questions. And it got me used to cross-examining them. It got me used to the critical listening and all of those skills that, you know, every 5 DUI cases, I might do a suppression motion. It's not every case. It's not never, it's just not that often. But once you go through like a whole hundreds of cases and I'm just used to cross-examining cops, it's not a big deal for me anymore. And so I think it kind of helps both sides to go through some sort of like baby step. You know, you get training wheels in the traffic court, and then later you come through, and you're better off when you get to the big leagues.
Yeah, I think it's huge. I actually think that more police departments should do a little bit more exposure with testimony because it's weird because in the moment you feel bad if you're getting cross-examined and you're not doing well. Obviously, you're like, oh, gee, this guy's making me look really bad. But I think in hindsight, right, like if you're being humble about this job as a constant learning environment, you know, it only takes if you're an intelligent person, it only takes getting roasted to pieces a couple times to be like, I need to change the way I do business, right? I need to be better at taking notes or articulating what happened or remembering what happened or whatever it is. And, you know, that makes the cops better, right?
Right.
And if they did something that's egregious that they get called on and get made fun of for essentially in court on cross, they stop doing it, which is kind of important. It's a humbling experience, but it's important for society, right? That cops learn a boundary. It's also important that if a cop did everything they're supposed to and they're really good at remembering and articulating, an attorney tries to jam them up, you know, they learn those defenses and it becomes more of a, you know, tit for tat, and the jury or whatever gets to decide who they believe and what they think the truth is. I think that's exactly how the system's supposed to work, right? Is there's supposed to be this pairing of wills and intelligence and articulation that all boil down to due process, right? That becomes the formula for due process. So yeah, I wish, you know, it's kind of crazy to me to work at a police department and talk to guys that have been cops for 2 or 3 years. And they're like, I have my first trial coming up. And I'm like, oh, have you ever testified before? And they're like, no. And I'm like, we should do some prep because it's going to be rough. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that's an advantage that traffic agencies do have, though. you knock the dust off early, frequently.
For sure. So I started following you some time ago and I saw your case briefs. And I want to say they're really well done. And it really reminded me of law school. It reminded me of like the notes I would make on the case, what's the issue, what are the facts, what is the law, how is the law applied to these facts. So I've been wanting to ask, how did you get into that? Like what?
Yes. So it kind of started early for me. As you know, you've had some decent exposure to CHP, and they're an extremely large organization, right? I mean, it's a pretty big police department. And so when you're working for an agency like that, like they do their best to train their guys, but it's just a big agency, and it's a big agency to train in. It's a huge organization to try to steer and direct, right? So I kind of started to learn early, like, oh, there's a bunch, like you have the penal code and the vehicle code, and you can read that all you want, right? But that doesn't really describe what is actually happening in the world of law, right? Because you have a penal code section that was written 30 years ago or whatever. Then there's like 30 cases in the last 30 years that essentially amend or change the spirit of that law. And so you're kind of like, oh, if I don't read all this other stuff, like I'm actually putting myself at risk. I could do stuff that violates, what would be standing law now. And so I started to realize like, oh, the department's going to do their best, but like I'm only going to get these updates maybe once a year, and they only have 8 hours to give it to me or whatever. So they're going to pick and choose the stuff they think's the most important. And so I started to realize, well, for me, I'm going to have to read this stuff because some of it is binding, and it like says, there's an expectation I'm going to know it. And so I'm like, if I don't read it, I could be putting myself at risk. So I started reading case law pretty early. And, I used to use there was a couple apps and like a couple like little cheat books back in the day that you could find. But even those were usually a couple years behind because people are having to read it and then manufacture it, and then they would sell it. And the thing is, I started thinking about that. There's a lot of people that create these pocketbooks for case law for cops. And I think that those are great, but they sell those, right? And a lot of cops, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of cops are like, hey, if the department doesn't provide it, I'm not paying. They think it's like a thing, like if I need it, the department will give it to me. I'm obviously not of that opinion. For me, I'm like, hey, these are all public. It's public case law. It's public record for the most part. And I'm like, I'm just going to try to make as many of these for free and make them digestible as I can. So around like 2020, COVID was happening. I was actually telecommuting for the most extent because I was working as a detective still. And I was like, they were like, don't come to the office. And I was like, okay, how do we do police work from home? But so while I was at home, I was like, I was reading a lot of case law, trying to just get better at my job. And I thought, a lot of these cases, other cops should probably know. And so I ended up starting this company, Forecast Securities Group. And I was like, what if I just started posting this stuff for free, every day, and people could follow along. And if they read it, maybe somewhere in the back of their mind when they're, at 2:30 in the morning, when they're doing something and they're about to make entry into like the curtilage of somebody's property, they could think back to some cases and go, well, this is, just like the home, it's secured, right? These people have made a reasonable expectation, start to like get some of the very basic understanding locked in their brain somewhere. And I just feel like this stuff should be free. I don't think people should charge for it. I mean, I'm not going to knock people for making money for it, but I think cops need to know this stuff because there have been cases where, especially in the Ninth Circuit, where the Ninth Circuit's reached back to previous cases and they say, hey, this case has been published for 10 years. Every cop that works should know these cases, and you're expected to know them and understand them. And if you violate those, right, that could be a qualified immunity issue where you could lose qualified immunity if it's settled law already and you just go violate it. You could lose qualified immunity if something happens. So that's how I got into it.
We talked about qualified immunity a little bit before we started. What exactly is it? And why is it important to cops?
Yeah. So basically, when you're doing things as a police officer, right, there's potential that you could injure or harm people or violate people's rights. And sometimes that violation is warranted and justified based on what's happening, facts and circumstances. Or it could even be an honest mistake, right? What people need to remember is that for the most part, cops are not necessarily out going to cause trouble, right? For the most part, police officers are sitting in a car somewhere and they're being ordered via a radio to go and respond to an incident. And when you get there, some of these incidents are volatile, they're convoluted, you have very little information, and you have to make some pretty serious choices with very limited information and time. Because for cops, it can go both ways. If we do nothing and somebody dies, we get sued for that. If we do something and somebody dies or gets injured, we can get sued for that too, right? So we have choices that we have to make, and we're not choosing necessarily most cases to be part of these incidents. We are not out causing a bar fight or whatever. We're being thrust into this as a third party, as supposed to go in and try to keep the peace or do whatever, effect arrests, whatever the objective is. Well, during that process, sometimes people get injured, they get killed, rights get violated. And, in those circumstances, people can file a claim, right, against the state, against the government entity, and against the officer themselves. And that claim is basically, my rights were violated. I think, that there needs to be some sort of either change in the law or monetary compensation for this violation of my rights. And what it comes down to is, should the officer be entitled to have to pay for this himself, right? Or is he immune from that based on the facts and circumstances that he was operating in the course and scope of his duty, and that he didn't violate any previously discussed law, basically. And so if you go and you make a genuine mistake, somebody dies or somebody gets injured and they sue, and they basically say, hey, nothing here shocks the conscience. It's not a violation of any previously discussed law. It was a genuine mistake, but maybe the officer did make a mistake, or there's a mistake in training or whatever. They basically go, look, this was not intentional, so the officer is not personally liable for this. The agency, on the other hand, right, still probably going to have to pay something if there's wrongdoing. And in that case, unfortunately, the agency pays, and a lot of times that actually means the taxpayer pays. But the reason that they're afforded that is because, again, these situations are volatile. They're not, in most cases, they're not self-produced by the officer. They're situations in which an officer is being thrust into and being forced to make decisions. Otherwise, it would be like a dereliction of duty type of thing, where, the agency could try to hold that person responsible if they didn't go. And so that's part of the job. And, it's not just police officers that have qualified immunity. It's pretty much any government official. So there are government officials that can make choices that also violate people's rights. It's just police officers are usually at the forefront of that, because when there's a volatile situation, we are the ones that have to go and be involved in that. And, obviously we're bringing weapons when we go. We're bringing the threat of government authority and force when we go. And so it's just it can be a very complicated situation. And a lot of times, most of these cases do not derive from like malice, and where the officer's going and there's an ego issue and they're going to go in there and just pound some skulls or whatever. It's usually a mistake. Like, it's usually genuine lack of training from the agency, or just a lack of experience, or it's a situation that's so convoluted it hasn't been settled in law. And it's just, when you're looking at it, you're dividing the facts after the fact, you're like, man, there was no opportunity for success here. This is just a very convoluted, chaotic scene that had to be brought under control a particular way, and the way it happened resulted in this violation of rights or use of force or whatever. So that's basically the layman's term of it. Obviously we could get into the weeds a little bit.
So it seems like a lot of people think that if we take away qualified immunity, it will make policing better. Do you see that at all? Because I don't really see that. I think it would kind of neuter the police and paralyze them and make them not want to take any action at all. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think taking away qualified immunity would be an absolute disaster. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because policing itself is an industry that's already kind of in trouble. And the reason I say that is because it's really difficult to find and recruit people who want to be in these situations, or willing even to be in these situations, right? Like, obviously I have a tremendous amount of respect for people who practice law. It takes a long time to get a law degree, and it takes a lot of experience to go through that and go through law school. And it takes some dedication, right? But at the end of the day, your risk of personal injury or death is relatively low practicing law. That is just not true from policing. Policing is a very volatile, dangerous job. And it's not the kind of danger that you get from like being a line worker or, even a firefighter or something, right? Some of those things are like, working on electrical and stuff. There could be a mistake. Somebody fails to do a lockout. You could get injured or killed. That's obviously a thing. Construction, same thing. In law enforcement, you have human beings that are actively maneuvering sometimes to try to kill you. And you have extremely volatile and high emotion situations that you're being thrust into that can turn very deadly. And what people don't realize is when an officer gets involved in, like, let's say a shooting, that is not a 2-week ordeal for that officer. That is going to be a 3 to 5 year process for every single use of force like that. Because you're going to go through a internal review, you're going to go through the agency the jurisdiction that you're in, they're going to do a criminal investigation. But usually the DA's office for the county you're in is going to conduct their own criminal investigation. And then after it's all said and done, in most of those cases, they actually go to some form of lawsuit. And so then that officer then is going to go through some form of civil litigation for the next 3 to 5 years. And currently, under the current system, most agencies try to grant some summary judgment or a qualified immunity ruling pretty early. Like, hey, was this in the course and scope of his duty? Nothing here was egregious. We didn't violate any standing case law or whatever. And so all of the expense of that process is usually covered by your agency, right? They're paying for the attorney. They're paying for you to show up to court. They're paying for the process.
Right.
Removing qualified immunity, though, would basically separate those two things, and a department could basically say, well, there's no qualified immunity. This person did this on their own, right? This officer, Officer Smith did this all on his own. This was not a department thing. And so it would basically be up to your organization that you work for to decide whether they're going to cover it or not, right? And most of these organizations, police departments, government entities are pretty risk averse, for one. And for two, they are also very, very financially conscious with decisions like this. And so if you're talking about $1 million lawsuit, in my opinion, most of these agencies are not going to go out of the way to cover this officer. They would cut this officer as fast as possible to try to avoid that monetary issue coming to the department. Okay, and what that would mean for officers is they just wouldn't do anything. You would get officers who would park and do as little as possible, which is not good for society. And you would also get officers who are scared to go to calls and take action. And, in some circumstances, that might be okay, right? But if you think about, let's say a domestic violence situation where, a guy is trying to stab his girlfriend to death, for instance, right? And an officer shows up there. If that officer is afraid to take action, that could result in the death of that other person. And we don't want a situation where officers are so afraid to make decisions that could save another person's life that we allow people to kill each other. And then we go, well, we didn't kill that lady, so sorry.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a type of policing that people want, because, if you look at all of the bad police incidents that we've seen over the years, they pale in comparison to the amount of people officers save on a regular basis. I mean, there are police officers saving other people's lives daily all over the country, and we just never hear about it because it's part of routine police work.
Right.
So, to basically answer that question, I think you remove qualified immunity, I think you're going to have a very different type of world with a lot more violence and a lot less effective police. You can't, no offense to police administrations, but they're not going to stick their neck out for the individual officer. And you're going to get a lot of officers that would resign, quit. When that happens on a massive scale, we lose institutional knowledge and experience. And what usually happens is we get less effective police that are worse at the job, not better.
Talked about domestic violence. Like, sometimes those cases are the worst. They're the worst. Defending them is really difficult. They get so ugly so fast. There's emotion.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that sometimes cops get into a situation and let's say they rescue the woman from the guy, and then the woman turns against the cop, has a little change of heart. And it's like, you're beating up my boyfriend. It's like they're like you said, volatile. They're unpredictable. And I don't particularly like them. I mean, I have my fair share of domestic violence cases that I'm handling right now. I probably have 4 or 5 that I'm doing, but they're not my favorite. I'd rather have speed contests, some kid doing donuts, doing an exhibition of speed all day long than an
Right.
easy case. Like that, loving the car cases, hating the cases where somebody has black eyes.
Yeah, and it's a really convoluted thing, right? There's a lot of, what people don't consider is like a domestic violence. There's a lot of personal manipulation that's happening behind the scenes, right? There's power dynamics at play, and a lot of times you're entering the situation, and yeah, if you use force, you do have to be careful because this person who you're trying to go help, right, absolutely can turn against you. And a lot of police officers actually annually get killed responding to domestic violence calls because they are super high emotion.
Right.
And, any cop who's worked a while will tell you that, you go to those cases, a lot of times those cases also fall apart in the back end because, 6 months goes by, the thing's working its way through trial and through the court and through all the processes, right? Preliminary hearing, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden they're back together, right? And now your witness, that's a witness victim, they're uncooperative. They don't want to testify. They want to recant everything they told you on the scene. And that's why I think body cams are a huge thing. That's actually a positive for law enforcement because now we go there, we kind of see, oh, she's all, maybe he or she's all beat up, and people can kind of see that now. Oh, this wasn't, they're not, this was a real incident that they can try to downplay after the fact, but at least it makes the officer look like, they're telling the truth. And this really was a crime, it's really complicated. Human interaction is very complicated.
You're right about the victims recanting. We get that all the time. And it's a funny thing when I go to the prosecutor and I say, listen, the victim recanted. Why don't we do a reduction here? Whatever it is. The prosecutor will say, oh, they all recant. That doesn't mean it. That doesn't mean anything to me. They'll say that. But on the other side of it, when the victim doesn't recant, they'll say, well, they want a prosecution here. Like either road leads to the prosecutor sticking to their guns and trying to max out the charges in the sentence. But so it goes. I mean, and you're right. I mean, a fair number of them do recant, and it's just the nature of the beast, right? Like
Yeah.
people have a fight and then they get over it.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have any big cases that you want to talk about or anything that you want to discuss? What's a memorable case for you where, you felt like accomplished or, if you could talk about it?
I don't know if I could talk about any of them that are open right now.
Yeah.
I've had some good victories and so first let me back up a little bit. If cops always do things right, then I should never win, right?
Right.
If they record everything accurately, if all the evidence lines up, then the defense attorney should never win. And so I've won cases that seem like they were unwinnable. And that goes down to like the most basic traffic case all the way up to felonies. But I got to tell you, man, my favorite cases to fight are ones where it seems like the client's innocent, where it seems like they've been overcharged, they've been falsely accused, and it's some puzzle that I have to figure out, my office has to figure out. We go digging through the evidence, we're piecing things together, and we're really like uncovering the truth. It's like, okay, this witness, this person said these things about my client saying something else. Let's do some digging and find out what the truth really is. And I've had felony cases that got completely dismissed by the district attorney's office where we walk into court after 6-7 months of battling and they have a motion to dismiss the entire thing. And it's like and sometimes at the end of it, it's just a massive relief. It feels so good to get there. Other times it's like I get the prosecutor. It's like, hey man, I've been telling you this for 4 or 5 months. I know we've had the case for 6 or 7, but I've been telling you this. Why did it take you so long? Why do we have to drag my client through it? But however we get there, I'm happy when we get there, right? I mean, sometimes the wheels of justice turn slowly. So I've had some cases like that we had to really fight to come around. I've had a number of cases that I thought were going to end up better than they did, where I thought everything was worked out, where I thought it looked really good. And then the judge just sentences the defendant. It's a new felony. They sentence them to felony probation. Okay, great. My client should be getting out. But then all of a sudden the judge says, but he also violated the probation on this prior misdemeanor, and I'm giving him the remainder of a year on that misdemeanor. And it's just and And it's like the prosecutor and I thought my guy was getting out. My guy thought he was getting out. Everybody thought the guy was going to come out, till the judge just comes and says, nope, we got another, whatever it's going to be, like 4.5, 5 months of them being in custody before they can get out. And just some of those, it takes the wind out of my sails when I walk out of court and something like that happens. But it's a roller coaster on this end. It's a roller coaster.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, like if cops do everything right, then you basically, there's no way for you to win. Right. And that's like that is the truth. Right. I think, some of my favorite cases are cases where it's really convoluted and, we are pretty sure we have the right guy. And in order to prove it, we have to do like really, really detailed detective or police work. Right. And I've had cases like that where it's like, well, I'm pretty sure this is the guy, right? Let's really dig in. Let's look through the cell phone records. Let's look through, surveillance camera footage at all of these locations where, these crimes supposedly happened. And then, then let's, do really detailed detective work and get a good interview and all this other stuff. And, then you have a guy like yourself come and put us to the test, right? And we're up there on the stand and we have to justify all of the actions we took and justify the quality of our investigation. And those are actually some of my favorite because that's like, in the olden days when guys would prepare for battle, right? That's the battle, right? We go and the ultimate test is I'm up there on the stand and I have a guy like you who you want the truth, I want the truth, and we're going to battle it out in the courtroom and figure out what the actual truth is there. And I think when you do a good job and you know that you've crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's, and you can stand on the quality of your investigation, you can go up there and testify and say, hey, like I looked at all this stuff. I looked at every angle I could possibly look at, and all of the signs still point towards this guy. Then I think those cases, make cops feel good because you're like, hey, all of my work has been audited by somebody who doesn't want me to win. And if the resolution is a guilty, then I think everyone can be pretty comfortable knowing that there wasn't a perversion of justice, right? Because the officers were diligent and they did all the things they're supposed to, and they followed all the protocols, all the interviews and stuff were conducted in accordance with the law. And, because sometimes people do commit crime. It's just, even when a person is very obviously guilty, it's still our job as police officers to make sure that we do all of the things we're supposed to do to be certain that judicial process, due process, and all that stuff happens. And that's part of the reason why I think the case law is so important is it's very easy to make mistakes. If you don't have that background knowledge, it's very easy to make mistakes that then somebody like yourself could go and use, right? Potentially to get somebody who is guilty of a crime off of that crime. And that is not the defense attorney's fault. That's the police officer's fault, right? Like you're doing your job. That's your job. Your job is to look for things that we did wrong, if any, and try to find the truth somewhere in there. And if we're making egregious mistakes that leave these wide open avenues for you to, to exercise due process through and go, hey, well, what about all of this other stuff that you didn't address? Or what about the fact that this statement was obtained illegally? Cops will oftentimes get upset about stuff like that. But the reality is that's our job. We can't make mistakes like that and then be upset. And I think that's part of, I think there's a general understanding from law enforcement that we have a duty to do that. But I think the public sometimes doesn't realize that, like, cops, even though they make those mistakes, sometimes it's a lack of training,
It's, well, in the law, the underlying principles are rights. Our rights are more important than any one case, right? So it's like the rights are going to trump it. And if this case is getting dismissed, even though the person did it, well, the rights are what's important. We don't want to trample the rights just to get this person. They'll do it again. We'll catch them again in the future, whatever. But yeah, and the other thing you said really resonated with me. Like I'm fine with a fair fight. I'm good with a fair fight. Like, let's get in there. Let's have a fair fight. I explain to my clients when they hire on that like there's no guarantees. I can't guarantee I'm going to beat a case. What I care about is what the evidence shows. I don't really even care if they did it. I just care about the evidence. And my job is to go through that chain, link by link. And I'll bring them into the office. We'll go through the chain together. We will look for a weak link in the chain, because in order for them to get successfully prosecuted, there needs to be an unbroken chain. And if we can go through that entire chain and find some weak links, I'm diving in. We're going in hard. We're going to get after those weak links. But if there are no weak links in a chain, we're going to switch. We're going to go from trying to beat the case to soften the landing. Then we're going to change gears. We're going to work on mitigation. We're going to work on maybe some negotiation, get this down to a lesser charge. And that's what we're going to work on in the second phase. But phase one, what does that evidence show? And how do they gather it, right?
Yeah, and that's why I wish more cops would talk to attorneys, to be honest with you, because you start to realize, like, oh, the better I do at this job, like, the less I have to testify, because you start to submit cases. You submit a case that is absolutely airtight, like, you know, and you can maybe talk about this a little bit, but, you know, I know I've submitted cases where I'm, you know, it's like a detective case, right? And I've racked my brain on this case and been working on it for a year or whatever, right? And, you know, I've written all the search warrants I can write. You know, I've done all of the detailed analysis of the evidence I can do. You know, interviewed all the people I can interview. Have, you know, evidence that's properly collected, and, you know, there's a appropriate chain of custody. It's an airtight case that has no weak links, like you said, right? And you can kind of tell when those cases get submitted, because you're like, okay, this is a big case, right? Like this thing should probably get litigated pretty heavily, right? And then it goes in there, and then they're like, yeah, this dude took a plea deal. And you're like, and, you know, that happens a lot more the better you are at your job. And I realize, like, that's probably the attorney looking through that officer's, you know, credentials, looking through the case and going like, hey, look, man, they're talking to their client like, look, this is probably not going to be a winnable case based on the fact that there just really isn't any manipulation to be had here. There's no weak link to manipulate or exploit. Like, this is a pretty robust, detailed investigation that does not look good for you, right? So you maybe want to, like you said, soften the blow. I don't know, can you speak to that? Have you had cases that where you know, like, and we talked a little bit about the ones where there's obvious issues, but have you had cases where, like, you sit a client down and go, look, man, it's in your best interest to just, you know?
No, that's the majority of the cases. We go through the evidence, and well over 50% of them, and it's a matter of mitigation at that point. But that process is what these people pay for. They can go through, sometimes they get a public defender and they're left in the dark and they don't get any communication. What I'm trying to do is I want them to see all of that evidence. I want them to come into the office. I've got a big screen over here that we could watch. We could watch the entire field sobriety test. We can look for holes in it. We will look at the police report. We'll go through line by line. Cop says they touched the hood. We don't see it on the video. Okay. That's something to talk about, right? Maybe it's a no drive DUI. Did the cop touch the hood? Was it warm to the touch? But it's not on the M bars. Okay, that's something we need to talk about. Maybe I need to put that cop on the stand. That process of going through that evidence is a big part of what I do. And it's lost on a lot of people. They get kind of speed run through the system if they don't get that, if they don't feel engaged in their process, if they say, my attorney didn't do a damn thing. There's a lot of people who say that about their criminal defense attorney. My attorney didn't do anything. And it's like, well, the attorney, you read the police report. They kind of assumed that the person was guilty, same as the prosecutor. They actually didn't do that much, right? But for me, what I've found is if I can bring the client in and we can review that evidence together, for one, they're going to be happier, on the tail end of it because they feel like they got their process. But two, they might see things that even I don't see. Like, I've read thousands of police reports, but they might see something. They might say, you know what, I remember the cop saying this and he wrote this in the report and it's wrong. Let's watch that video. And they might catch something that's a real issue that I can sink my teeth into.
Yeah. I think what you're expressing is just like communication, right? I think people want that communication, an open line of communication. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I started following your page was I noticed you started just real informal posts about, hey, you know, today I'm working this case. I got this and this going on. And I think it just brings that human level to a job that is like policing. Policing is often viewed as like secret and convoluted, and like not a lot of people really know about the nuances of policing. And that's why I think case law is important, because you start to look at the details of day-to-day police conduct. You know, obviously these are highly litigated cases, but I think that's what I like about your brand right now is like, you're like, hey, this is the day-to-day of lawyering, right? This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like to litigate these 2 hit and runs in a DUI market today. And we're going to go try to testify on this stuff or try to find these loopholes or whatever. And, I think both sides of the law, right? The defense side and the criminal prosecution, investigation, all that other, I think there just needs to be more clarity. That's why the qualified immunity issue, I think, is such a big deal, is because there's not enough clarity about what that actually means, right? They don't realize that officers lose qualified immunity all the time. And sometimes it's for things that don't even make sense. So I like your level of communication with not just your clients, it seems like, but the public, right? It seems like you have an open line of communication with the public, which I think is important in this industry.
You say that, but you don't have to read all the DMs I get from people who are all one, right?
Yeah. I'm sure. My page gets a fair share too. I mean, in any of the posts that I post, you can find usually one comment in there that's like, "Oh, only good cops are dead cops." It's like,
right,
pal. You get it. You know what I mean?
The sovereign citizens get after me. There's something else, but I could tell you when I first opened my office, I looked into Google pay-per-click. Like, you can pay to get your clicks for people who look for like DUI attorney near me, and they'll click, and that just gets you the phone call. They'll click on your thing and you get the phone. It's still up to you to sign that person up. But the cost of pay-per-click for DUI attorney near me in my county is around $35 a click. There are a few large criminal defense firms in my county, and they're reputable firms. I know those attorneys are good attorneys. They're dumping in $20,000, $30,000 a month into Google marketing. And I knew that when I first got started, and I thought, that's all the money I have. That's all the money in my bank account that I could work with. And I thought, I want to talk directly to people. Like, I'm going around Google. I'm just going to get on the internet. I'm going to talk directly to people. I'm going to talk about what's happening in the neighborhood. Cops pulled over a bunch of kids riding on bicycles, charged them with felony evasion. Actually, I don't think that's right. You can't do evasion on a bicycle. I'm going to talk about that. I'll put that out there. And then all those little kids, they all reshare it. Pretty soon it's got 25,000 views. And then I just started getting more and more followers, and that's how I did it. So I wanted to keep that going, talking about what I see and communicating directly to people instead of going through big tech and Google and all that. And that's not to say that I won't get into more paid marketing. I'm kind of exploring that right now, but I just don't want to fight that fight. I don't want that I don't want to get into a bidding war against these guys who've been doing it for 40 years and they own the buildings around town, and the attorney has his son working for him, or this attorney over here has 5 lawyers working for him, and they're running a massive operation. I can't compete for the top bid on that. But I just want to talk directly to people. And the other side of it is, I think that in people's minds, when they hear me talking about a case and what I'm doing to solve the case, if they catch a case in their mind's eye, they can already envision me fighting for them, right? Because they've seen it over and over and over again. And I don't want them to Google attorney near me. I want them to Google Chris Cain, right? Like, I want awareness marketing.
Yeah.
I don't want demand marketing. I don't want people to have to pick me based on my Google 5-star reviews or whatever it is. I want them to already think about me. That's why I just want to talk directly to the people.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that drew me to your page, was just like, being very open and honest with, like, how you're litigating cases and stuff, and kind of peeling back the curtain a little bit, like, hey, I've got a hit and run, and it's the first one they've ever done, so we're going to try to find a resolution. I just think that is a really intelligent way to market what is normally a very secretive business. I mean, the business of lawyering tends to be very secretive. It's a convoluted process that people don't, they think, some people are under the impression that lawyers have like some sort of magic, right? When it's just, like you had talked about before, it's, a fine, detailed review of the facts that leads you to a conclusion that either, hey, we should try to plead this case down and soften the landing, or this case is full of mistakes and the officer didn't do a very good job, and so maybe we should argue this case. That is the true power of an attorney, is knowing those two differences and knowing how to find those issues. And that's, I think I've used attorneys for a lot of different stuff, business and, all kinds of stuff. And my view of an attorney, right, and I've obviously gone against a bunch of defense attorneys in court, my view of them is, the ones that communicate and are detail oriented and are easy to get a hold of, those are the best attorneys you can find. because those guys are the ones that are going to put the time into your case. They're going to look for the best resolution for you. They seem to have a vested interest in the outcome for you. And you're not just a paycheck, and I've definitely had other attorneys for other things that are just, they're kind of hard to get a hold of. And you're like, man, I really have a question. I'm concerned about this thing. And I think what you have going right now, where it's making you seem very approachable, easy to get a hold of. I think that is a smart, from my perspective, smart business move. Lawyering aside, business for business.
Well, that's a huge part of my energy as well. Like at some point I realized I know how to fight these cases. Now I have to learn the business of it. I have to learn how to get the cases. I have to learn how to do intake. I need a funnel on my website. I need to turn interested people into clients, do proper marketing, have people that are trained specifically on intake in my office, have people trained on case management to try to get the clients the results of the hearing as quickly as possible after the hearing. Like if I go in there and some things happen, we set a new court date, the client should find out within 24 hours. I mean, 48 hours at the most, but we should let them know, hey, the attorney went to court for you today. They've requested the calibration and maintenance logs on the breath or chemical device. That'll be coming. When we get it, we're going to let you know your next court is on this date, and we'll give you an update when it comes. And I think that customer service and that business aspect of it, it's like it's a whole animal on its own, right? It's a whole different thing that, in addition to just going to court.
Yeah.
It's not for the faint of heart. Running a law firm is not the same as working for the public defender's office or working for Big Law or working for some other attorney who just says, listen, I'm going to give you $10,000, $12,000 a month and you're going to have to handle 30 cases a month. Here, go. And that there's a purity in that, right? There's a simplicity for those attorneys who just get the focus on those cases. But I'm doing a little bit more, right? So I'm trying to accomplish more. But I also think that in comparison to solo criminal defense attorneys, there's a lot of guys who are just solo, or maybe it's one or two attorneys and they have a secretary. I think that what I've done, having a big staff that's constantly contacting the clients, I think that we provide a better product. Like we have better customer service, because even if I'm in court, someone's going to be there to answer their call, right? Like no matter when it is, there's going to be somebody there to help that person through it and give them an update with the latest. Something funny though, I think talking directly into the camera, it really makes people feel like they know you, right? And I don't mind if I like run into people on the street and they know me, or cops say hi on the street and they know me. I'm good with that. I like that. But I'll get a comment, or I'll get a DM that's like, yo man, what's up with my case? And the name is like, it's like, I don't know, 831 Camaro is a screen name, right? Like, and I'm like, dude, I don't know who the hell you are, man. I don't know. And it's like, oh, and I go, I don't know. And it's like, can you contact the office? Like, I contacted the office an hour ago, and I'm looking at my phone, and it's like 7:30 on a Friday night. I'm like, yeah, man, we're closed. Like, you contact the office. Can you contact them again on Monday if you don't hear back? And they'll let you know, because they might even know before I do. They'll know when your next court thing is. They'll hear from the court before I do, and I might not even look at it until 24 hours before I go into court. So there is kind of a disconnect on some of the, like, we're doing 60 traffic cases a month. I can't have all that committed to memory. There's not enough space in my head. So there's kind of a little disconnect where I'm a little bit removed from a lot of the cases, but my staff's on it. Like they have almost all those memorized. I mean, among them, they'll know. I'll go in there. I'll be like, hey, what's happening with so-and-so? And they're like, yeah, that's the case about this or that. Like, okay, they just messaged me on Instagram wanting an update. Like, we gave them an update earlier. Like, okay. So the business thing is its own animal. I guess that's the long way of, or the short way of saying it.
Yeah, I think it's just impressive to have it be so like personable. Like, I think the talking directly to the camera is what does it. I think it makes it just seem very approachable. Unfortunately, as law enforcement, we can't really do that. As a matter of fact, we get in trouble a lot of times if we do that. You know what I mean?
The DAs can't do it either.
Yeah. But it's that, and that's kind of one of my goals with this page too, with my business, is to make it like, you read some of the cases and you go, oh, the cops actually didn't really mean to do anything wrong. Like, this is just a convoluted set of circumstances, and ultimately, I think my goal with that page is to improve the quality of police officers if we can, because what will surprise a lot of people is a lot of the agencies do not do a very good job training. And it becomes very evident, right? I'm sure in court when you have guys make egregious but genuine mistakes that you go, look, that's not how any of this works. And you probably capitalize on that, but that a lot of times is the agency's fault, not necessarily the officer's fault. There's only so much time or money to train. And, if you're working in an agency that's overworked and undertrained, it's really difficult for an officer sometimes to get adequate training. So, I think trying to make as much small distilled information available for free is kind of the goal of the business's Instagram. It's to try to hey, read through these cases. So what's your perspective on police training?
Yeah, I don't think there's enough. I kind of touched on this before we started. I really think that cops need to do something like jujitsu or some sort of martial art, one thing or another. I mean, judo, jujitsu, even Muay Thai, they need to do something there. And it's regrettable that more agencies don't support that. And I kind of understand, maybe they don't want their cops getting injured in jujitsu. Maybe they don't want to pay for it, whatever it is. But I wish cops would do more grappling, because a lot of times I'll see something, whether in the news or in one of my own cases, where an officer uses some level of force. And my thoughts are, is this cop, did he lose his cool? Did he lose his cool? And that's why he and it's an ego thing. And that's why he's meting out punishment and justice on the side of the road? Or is he just poorly trained? And my conclusion is that the more officers are exposed to the stress of having another grown man in their face trying to physically overpower them, the more they'll be inoculated against it, right? It's like, this isn't the first time someone's got in my face this week. I was at jiu-jitsu this morning. I'm fine with this. Let's go. Let's do it. I'll handle it. It'll be professional. It'll be quick. It'll be painless. And we'll get this guy in handcuffs. I wish cops would embrace that more, or their agencies would embrace it more, because I think that'd be a solution to a lot of the police brutality that kind of makes national news.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. I noticed the other day you posted you rolling around in a suit. I think it's one of those things where it's like, if you've never been in a serious physical fight before, which there are a lot of cops that's true, where maybe they've been working for 2 or 3 years and they haven't had a big knockout drag out yet. And when that happens to you and you realize oh, I'm really out of breath because I'm scared and I'm breathing heavy and my cardio maybe isn't as good as it could be. And then you're like, oh, I'm tired now. I'm out of breath. You're panicked. And then you start to realize they were teaching, my department taught me that this one cuffing technique always works. And then, you start to realize in practice that this actually doesn't work, right? I can't just grab a limb and, this guy is incredibly strong. He's overpowering me. And I think you're right about, the thing about jiu-jitsu that's nice is, or judo or whatever is, you get on the mat and, maybe one day you're rolling around with a guy who's 130 pounds, right? But then the next day you're rolling around with a guy who's 250 pounds, right? And you're like, oh, everything is very different with this other person's body shape and size. This 250-pound guy is, his weight and size is an advantage. But then, you get a guy who's 130 pounds who's highly skilled, and you're like, oh, this guy is really maneuverable and he can manipulate me also. And so I think when you start to see those perspectives, I'm 100% in agreement with you. I think some basic level grappling, whether it be jiu-jitsu or judo, should be a requirement. And the reason is because there needs to be some basic level of how to control another human being. Every agency has their own different cuffing techniques, but a lot of them are oriented around a voluntary compliant person,
Right.
Which, my thought process on that is, okay, well, if they're voluntary and compliant and they're not going to fight, I could just literally tell them, hey man, put these handcuffs on, and the result will be the same. Right. Like I could say, hey, put your hands behind your back. And if they do that, I could just slap the cuffs on. I don't really need a special technique for that. It's the guy who's going to be like, I don't think so, pal. And they're going to be like, you're not getting those cuffs on me no matter what. And that's the guy that we have to worry about, right? The guy who's going to be like, nope, we're going to go on a knockout, drag out fight. A lot of agencies are not giving their officers those skill sets. Do you know of some agencies that, and I'm not going to name any names, but I do know some agencies that do have in-house jiu-jitsu programs. And those agencies tend to perform significantly better when it comes to chaotic use of force. It usually looks a lot cleaner. People are less injured because the officers are doing jiu-jitsu. Even the guys that aren't like really into it, right? They're just like, it's not for me. But they're still doing, every year they're still doing, 8 hours, 10 hours of some basic level jiu-jitsu. They've seen some stuff before, right? And so when they get out there, they're like, oh, well, I have a couple tools in the toolbox to help me handle this problem. I'm 100% agreement with that. I think a lot of problems that we encounter in law enforcement tend to become a hands problem that we try to use tools for. And that is not necessarily a good thing, right? I mean, the taser is a great tool. We have good tools sometimes, but there are guys who are they're obstructive in a sense. They don't want to go with the program, but they're not necessarily physically combative initially.
Right.
We can't just tase or baton those people who are and they don't want to go with the program. They don't really want to go into custody, but they're not really a threat yet. And then what happens is when inexperienced or, poorly trained officers go hands on, things tend to escalate, right? And when they escalate, now this person can become a physical threat, and the use of force tends to increase. We've seen that over and over and over again. I mean, even really hot topic ones, like the one that set the country on fire, the George Floyd case, a lot of that obviously looked terrible, but a lot of that came down to training. Some of the tactics he was engaged in were actually sanctioned by his department. And it's like that shouldn't be a thing where we have poor tactics being distilled down to an officer level. And I think there needs to be some improvement for sure.
Right. When alcohol gets involved, people, they may not even know that they're resisting in a certain way. And then the other part of it is the verbal jujitsu, right? Like the verbal de-escalation techniques, and officers need some level of just total loss of ego. And it's like, this guy's insulting the cop, and they need to just kind of roll with it and say, no, actually, it's my job to be here, whatever it is, right? Whatever it is, but to de-escalate it in a different way. And I think there's training that can happen there too. So yeah, the thing that I think about a lot is hindsight is 2020, right? And the other day I posted something on TikTok saying I was coming out of jail. I just visited a client in jail. The conditions are crap in that jail. And I said, I think the district attorney should have to spend the night in jail. They should at least see what it's like on the inside of a jail, because they'll throw it around. They'll be like, oh, your guy needs to do 30 days actual in custody, programs denied. It's like, well, have you ever been there? You've been a DA for 7 months, and this is your assessment. You've never had another job before. Went right to law school after college, got right into this job. Have you ever even been to the jail? Do you know what it's like? You want my guy to go in there for 30 days. Like, please go take a look. The other side of that is, I think that sometimes defense attorneys might need some real life experience. Like I said, maybe they should do police ride-alongs. Maybe they should go make friends with the cop and ride around for a night and see what it's really like out there. See how quickly things happen without the benefit of 2020 hindsight. And I'm not trying to soften up the defense attorneys. I want us to go as hard as possible every single time. But just that sometimes if it's too much, if it's too contentious, if it's this side versus that side, then the humanity of it all is lost.
Yeah, I have a funny story about that exact thing. So growing up, I never wanted to be a cop. Actually, my dad owned a body shop. I was like working towards being a mechanic, and I actually was a mechanic for a while. And I had some modified cars and stuff like that. And I remember getting stopped by the police like all the time, like in these modified cars. And I'm like, dude, these guys are harassing me. Like they know it's me. They're harassing me. These cops hate me.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And I was always under the impression that like these guys were they could see it was me, or they were out to get me. And then I did my first ride along with the highway patrol back in like 2000s. I'm riding in the car, and he's like, oh, we got this guy on radar speeding. We're going to flip around and stop him. And I was realizing, like, dude, you can't see who's in these cars. Like we have no idea who's in that car. Like, that car is 1,000 feet away on radar. Like, I have no idea what even kind of car that is yet. And then as the car gets closer, he's like, oh, yep, that's the car. We're doing our good tracking. And they would stop these guys. And I'm like, it was like an epiphany moment. It completely changed my perspective. I was like, oh, all these years that I thought I had like this contentious relationship with law enforcement, it turns out like I was just wrong. Like, these guys didn't know who was in that car. Like, my car is just a shitty modified car. and like they saw it and they were like, hey, this car is modified illegally. We got to stop talking to this guy, and that changed single ride along completely reframed my opinion of the police from a guy who was like not necessarily supportive of law enforcement. And then to somebody who was like, oh, a lot of this is just general unknown. These guys are stopping cars. They don't know. There are circumstances in a city where guys are well known to law enforcement. That does happen. The vast majority of people, especially like the highway patrol, for instance, right? I've made thousands and thousands and thousands of traffic stops in my career, and the vast majority of them are completely unknown. I don't know who this person is. I don't have any history with this person. I saw a violation and I'm taking action on that violation. And that's a lot of people, I think, would realize if they rode with officers for just a day, they would realize like, oh, with a car with tinted windows, you really can't see inside.
Right.
A car that's 1,000 feet ahead of you at nighttime, you can't even see how many people are in there. You have no idea, right? Like you just see a violation, they take action on it, and like all of those other things about like, oh, they're targeting me, and a lot of that is just when you ride in a car with a police officer, you kind of realize like, oh, this guy's thinking about going to In-N-Out for lunch, and he's not actually thinking about like trying to find me to get after me. Like, he's on his way in and out, and I cut him off, and I did a vehicle driving violation, and I'm interrupting his lunch, and that's why I'm getting stopped.
Right.
It completely changes your perspective. So I actually wish that was a thing for. I wish police ride-alongs were a thing that was required in high school. I think that would clear up a lot.
Well, it's funny. I've had clients that say they're getting targeted or they're getting harassed, and a lot of these cases, like low-level misdemeanor cases, reckless driving, speed contest type cases, we can get them dismissed. If a person has not been in trouble with the law before, we can get them dismissed. And the client will say, hey, listen, they're targeting me. And I'll say, you know what? Yeah. Don't give them an excuse. They are after you. You need to drive like a grandma for at least the next year while we resolve this case. They're looking for you. And so I don't know if it's true or not, right? Like, the guy's got some modded out car. Maybe he's in a smaller town in this county and the cops are looking for them. That's what they think, but maybe that's what they need to think, right? In order to be on their best behavior. The worst is when people have it in their mind, these cops are stupid, they'll never find out. That's just a dangerous mindset when people have that, and they think they're just going to keep getting away with breaking the law. And I'd rather have them be paranoid than be reckless, right? I'd rather have them be paranoid and law-abiding. But for sure, I got a CHP buddy here. He said he was writing a bunch of tickets to San Luis Obispo, and like the dean or some chancellor from the school said, you're targeting my students. You need to stop. He got that administrator into his vehicle. He said, come do a 12-hour shift with me. We'll do it at night when all these people are getting these tickets. And the administrator was like, after an hour or two, was like, yeah, I can't see anybody. I can't. It'd be impossible to recognize if it's a CSU or a San Luis Obispo student or not. Like, I'm done. I've seen enough. You can let me out. And it's just like, it's the way it is. It's if the person's not breaking the law, they're not breaking the law.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And the same thing goes. I mean, I actually kind of agree with your topic on the jail thing too, because like, obviously law enforcement, we don't spend time in the jail cell per se, but we take a lot of people to the jail and we see what the conditions are like in those jail facilities, and you see what it's like when people are getting processed, and how humbling of an experience that is. So it's easy for somebody who's never even set foot inside of a jail to go, they go to jail. This person's got to go to jail.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, the same thing with the ride along perspective, right? I think, altering your point of view and seeing something that you've never seen before can completely shift the way that you think. And I think that like, my thing with law enforcement is a lot of law enforcement use of force cases, right, start to devolve when there's a lack of compliance, right? An officer gives instruction, they're legally allowed to be there. They're giving an order essentially, right? Hey, put your hands up or whatever, or don't do this or don't do that. And then people do it because they feel that they're not obligated to listen. And then that's usually where things start to deteriorate. And it's like, if you could go on a ride along or, you know, see the inside of a jail or change your perspective and realize that, like, oh, you know, this officer's giving these instructions because they're afraid of the threat that this person could pose to their personal safety. And when you're on the other end of that for the first time, like I remember my very, very, very first traffic stop as a highway patrolman. It was a speed stop and it was barely speeding. Barely. I'm talking like 75 or something. It was not crazy, egregious speed. And it ended up being like an 85-year-old lady. But walking up to that car, right? This was my first traffic stop I've ever made as a real police officer. I was like, this person's going to shoot me to death for sure. Right. And I got up there and I'm essentially shaking like a leaf because I'm like, dude, this is it. This guy could die right now. And I got up there and he was like this really sweet 85-year-old lady. He's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I must have been going too fast. And I started to realize, like, oh, this is what these cops have been talking about this whole time. This is actually really scary. Right. And, you know, obviously the more you do it, the exposure and fear goes down. But for the general public, it's easy to be like, well, I'm not a threat. I don't know why he's ordering me to do stuff. But these officers don't necessarily know you, and they don't know if you're a threat or not. And so I think a ride along like in high school or college would be a huge benefit to society. I think people should go visit jail too. I think, you know, there should be like a civics week where you do a police ride along. You know, you sit along with the prosecuting attorney, you sit along with the defense attorney for a week and, you know, or a couple of days. And you go do a shift with the correctional deputy where you see the inside of a jail cell and, you know, maybe they close the door behind you and you spend a little time, 30 minutes or something inside of a concrete jail cell that doesn't get cleaned very often. And it's gross. It smells like feet in there, you know, and you go, oh, this is not a place I'd ever want to come back to. I think that would be a huge benefit to society as a whole if there was a little bit more perspective, which is kind of why I wanted to have this conversation with you in the first place. As far as the public's concerned, we're enemies, right?
Right.
But as far as I'm concerned, we're just two different parts of the same system. And the more we kind of work together, the better both of us are going to be, right? You want cops to have put good cases together that are litigated on the facts, and cops don't want to be manipulated into looking like morons if they can avoid it. And I think the only way to do that is to shift our perspective a little bit, right? I need to see stuff from the criminal defense attorney's point of view, and maybe you need to see things from my point of view. And I think we both would benefit from that, which is why I think this conversation is so important.
Yeah. So I actually have an approach when I'm negotiating cases with the district attorneys here where I'll name the best part of their case. You know, I'll say, hey, I think my guy's good for the DV. He's good for the DV. What he's not good for is the false imprisonment. Because if you think anytime someone climbs on top of another person to fight them, it's DV and false imprisonment with a single act, there's something wrong there. But I think you're right about the DV. You're wrong about the false imprisonment. Let's do a hearing on this. You know, if we can't, there's no meeting of the minds. It takes the wind out of their sails if they're used to someone just being combative the whole time, right? Because it takes away their counter argument, but the DV, right? Like I can't just go in and say, you're not good for the false imprisonment. They'll be like, no, but we're good for the DV. It's like, no, I've already named that. I've already addressed that one. I grant you that, you know, let's talk about where the real problem is. And I'm not trying to play hide the ball either. There are some defense attorneys, and I get it. They say never reveal your full defense strategy. And I'm not trying to reveal everything. And it's like they want to catch the DA off guard. They want to catch the cop off guard on the stand. I'm okay with that to an extent, especially when the cop is lying and whatever it is. You need to catch him in a lie. That makes sense. But for the most part, I'm more along the lines of like, let's be realistic here. Let's not play games. Like let's get to the truth of what actually happened. Like what does the evidence actually show? Let's get to the bottom of this. And for me, that's helped. Right? Because I think that gives me credibility with the prosecutors here. They like working with me and I like working with them. And they don't think I'm some sneaky son of a bitch who's going to pull a fast one on them. Right? And then they listen to what I say. and then they really take a look at it. They're like, maybe there is no false imprisonment on this DV case, right? Maybe I should dismiss that. So that's kind of my approach on it. I got a question for you. What other like kind of perspective switches have you had? What other eye openers have you had? Because I've got mine.
Yeah. So, I think another eye opener that I've had, which is going to be a little controversial, is, typically everybody views law enforcement as like this big family, right? Like it's the thin blue line. They always 100% always have each other's back. That's actually not true. I've worked for different agencies and I've had exposure to a lot of different police departments because, one of my jobs was I was working as a detective for a division. So I was, working with agencies. I was working with a bunch of different counties. What I've really come to realize is that leadership is a huge factor in law enforcement organizations, and that some organizations are really, really, really good and they are genuinely like a family. And others are very, very, very bad. And they're actually not like a family, and they will target their own employees and they'll target people. And that perspective was kind of a hard one to put my mind around, that there are places that you could work that, would not treat you like with respect, despite whatever your reputational background is, or you can even do everything that you think you're supposed to be doing, and they will come after you and retaliate against you and things like that. That is not just here. That's nationwide. There are some organizations that are legitimately just not good. And that was kind of hard, because for me, once I got into law enforcement, the vast, vast, vast majority of the guys that you meet in law enforcement are genuinely good people, right? They want to help others. They have a service-oriented mindset. They sacrifice holidays, weekends, time away from their family, personal health. I mean, most people don't realize that the average cop dies at 57. Most cops are retiring anywhere between 50 to 58. So some cops are dying on duty. That's a pretty tremendous sacrifice. And so the kind of person that does that is typically not the kind of person that is vindictive, retaliatory, right? But like with anything in life, some people find their way to the top of organizations or to positions of power. And that has been a hard lesson over my career, to learn that some of the people that I would have given default like presumption of them being good people are not. And that there are manipulative, vindictive people working in this industry that is typically self-sacrificing and, community oriented. That is a hard lesson for me to learn. It's just hard to think about, but it's true. And, that's why sometimes some of these use of force instances are just egregious, because maybe some of those are the people that we didn't really want in the industry that made their way in here somehow. So that's tough, right? I mean, because you don't want to think of your fellow officers like that, but it does happen from time to time. And it is tragic, I guess, to put it in any simple terms.
Maybe it's still a family, right? Like you've got good families, you've got dysfunctional families, right? And
Yeah.
some families have their bad apples, and some of the families are just not. Maybe the head of the household or the admin, the person at top is just not. There's no good leadership in that family. But
yeah,
I'll tell you two things that changed it for me. I already kind of mentioned it, but working with all those CHP guys and just seeing them, and sometimes there'd be a big lag between when I arrived and when we'd start doing the trials, and just talking to them, just person to person. Like once they got comfortable around me, and the new ones were always standoffish, right? They'd be standoffish.
Well, you're the enemy.
Yeah, right. Who's this defense attorney? But like once we got past that, it's like they're just dudes. They're women too. They're just people, and they make mistakes. They get things right. They get things wrong, just like anyone else. And for me, I really appreciated that, because I like seeing people as people. And that's actually something I really like about criminal defense, because my clients are a lot more than that police report. They're more than their worst behavior on the worst night of their life, right? And a big part of my job is showing that they can't just be defined. The rest of their future won't be defined by the worst night of their life. Like these are just people as well. So it's kind of a humanistic view on things, and people being people, and things not being so black and white. The other thing that kind of changed the way I view things, like I was a bad driver growing up. I didn't like the cops. I was getting in trouble all the time, but I think that I was like trying to stick it to the man. Like I was a little bit rebellious, and I was like, "Well, f you,
Yeah.
officer," type young little punk ass dude. And I think I was trying to stick it to the man until I became a man, right? Until I whatever it is, the cliche, until I started paying taxes, until I was standing on my own 2 feet, until I realized that I don't really need to like buck the whole system and burn it all down because there's no future here for me. Once I saw a future for myself, once I could see myself like being a man and being, contributing in society, then I was more accepting. I stopped saying F you, officer, that sort of a thing. So those are two
Right.
little turning points. One was a little bit bigger than the other, right? One was personal thing. The other was just with the cops that I see all the time and me kind of applying that to all cops.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. And I think that kind of goes back to our like ride along perspective, right?
Mhm.
I think that is a very common perspective amongst young people. Mine was kind of the same, right? Like these guys are targeting me. Like these guys are out to get me, right? Like they just hate guys with modified cars or whatever, right? And then, I started realizing like, well, no, they're targeting me because my car looks bad, or it's got all these illegal modifications on there. Like maybe I should just drive a normal car, and then all of a
Right.
sudden you start driving like a normal car. You're like, oh yeah, never mind. They're not targeting me. Like I'm just violating the law. I need to stop doing that. I think that's yeah, I think the perspective stuff, like, one of the things that I've learned over my career too is, you learn that you have the authority to do stuff sometimes in law enforcement, right? Oh, I can order somebody out of a car or something, right? You go to do that and they're like, no, I'm not getting out of the car. And you're like, oh, you're getting out. And you start to realize like, oh, if I just take a second though, and I explain to this person why I want to do this, sometimes that makes a huge difference, right? So like, I've had guys who are like, no, I'm not getting out of the car. And I'm like, hey, look, man, like it's 2:30 in the morning. I'm here by myself. Okay. There's a loaded pistol magazine in the back seat. Okay. I can see it from the window, right? There's gun accessories in the back seat. I'm concerned for my safety. That's why I want to get you out of the car. Okay. I'm not trying to just be rude to you. Okay. I'm worried you're dangerous to me.
Mhm.
And they're like, oh yeah. I'm like, can you see this from my perspective? You have gun stuff in the car. And they're like, oh. And I'm like, I'm not saying you're under arrest or anything, but I'd like to talk to you by my car. And they're like, well, now that you kind of explain it that way, that
Right.
actually makes sense. They're like, yeah. And then they're like, oh, I'll get out of the car. And then they're like, I don't have anything on me, officer. And you're like, okay, do you mind if I check? And they're like, no, I'm fine. I don't have anything. And you're like, okay. And then you have your casual conversation about whatever you're having a conversation about. But I think a lot of times when we're younger, we lack the ability to explain why we're thinking what we're thinking or why we want to do what we want to do. And I think that's a big disadvantage to us. And I think with more life experience, more growth, we start to go, okay, I have to explain myself a little bit better so that people understand the perspective that I'm standing in. And I think the same thing happens with criminal defense too, right? An officer puts a case together and then they send it to court and they go, this guy's guilty, right? But the defense attorney's like, hey man, like maybe he did this, but like you improperly handled this evidence and
Right.
the chain of custody has been broken and we don't know for sure if this is his X, Y, or Z. And, like you didn't really explain that in the police report and you didn't really talk about how you collected this. And now this is an issue because somebody's life could be permanently changed. And I think that is all part of one of the things that I harp on in the slides that I break down the stuff is like, you have to articulate that is a repeating thing that happens in the slides where I'm like, hey, a little officer takeaway in the future is if you're doing something, you have to, with extreme detail, articulate the thought process, the reason, and all this other stuff. That has been a huge perspective shift for me as well. It's like, hey, everything we do has to be absolutely justified and articulated and explained. So anybody who's reading that report or looking at our actions objectively can go, well, when I think about it the way the officer was thinking about it, that actually makes a lot of sense. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Well, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and maturity goes a long way. And I'm also thinking about times when the officer does almost everything right, but then the blood sample is left in the back of a hot patrol car for 14 hours. It goes off to the DOJ. They don't refrigerate it for 2 weeks. Then they throw it in the fridge for a week, and then they run the thing. And I'm in there saying, I'm in court saying, like, you wouldn't leave milk out for 2 weeks and then refrigerate it and then pour it into your coffee, would you? You know, like, it's, I care about that evidence. I care about that chain of custody. The cop thinks my guy's guilty. The cop was there. My client had alcohol in their breath, whatever it was, right? My cops saw it with their own eyes. They're convinced that this person was driving drunk. But I want to know about that blood sample. I want to know exactly where did it go from there? You know, why is the envelope, why is it missing signatures on the chain of custody envelope? What is going on with that actual piece of evidence? I mean, there's a lot of things that go in. We need that unbroken chain, going back to that chain. And the officer can, they from their perspective, the chain's perfect sometimes. But from my perspective, there's going to be some weak links. So I mean, that's where I make my money.
Yeah, I think that's completely justified, right? Because let's say the officer does do everything right, but the system, the logistical system involved is flawed, right? That's not the officer's fault, but the counterpoint to that is if the system is damaged in a way that it potentially manipulates or violates an individual's rights, then that case should be thrown out. And the reason is because we cannot have a system that traverses people's freedoms, right, for the sake of conviction, right, as opposed to a system that if we're a police organization, we need to have appropriate systems in place that when a blood evidence is submitted, it goes directly into a refrigerator and it stays there till it goes to wherever it's supposed to go to. That's on us, right? Like that really is on us. We need to have, if you're an administrator, you shouldn't allow that to happen. That's crazy. And if that does happen, then that case should get dismissed, right? And that's just a fair, impartial way to look at it. Well, look, we've been going for an hour and 30 minutes now. So how about I give you closing arguments? What do you got?
No, I just appreciate the time. I like talking to you. I like hearing your perspective on things. I think that we are like-minded on a lot of stuff, and more similar than dissimilar in our views. And I think that if more people have conversations about things, we'd see that if you draw Venn diagrams around the cops, around the defense attorneys, around the prosecutors, most people can meet in the middle on like 85, 90% of things. But for whatever reason, we tend to focus on the things that we don't agree on most of the time. So I'm all about having the conversations. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, man, the same here, man. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really like what you're doing with your business. I think your open, honest perspective, I think is refreshing, right? The fact that you're willing to sit down with me, right? The quote unquote, the enemy, and have a conversation, I think is really refreshing. I would definitely be down to do it again if we have another topic we want to discuss. Dude, I think everything that we talked about today makes total sense. And hopefully it helps cops or defense attorneys or prosecuting attorneys or, whoever, even just the general public. They're listening to this, they go, oh, this added some clarity. That's, I think the goal of having these open, honest conversations. So I've really enjoyed myself.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time, huh?
Thanks again.